Hello, this is Dasha, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the May 8th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Beginning with some international news, Trump hosts Brazil's leader after months of up and down. By Adam Ellick. President Trump hosted President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva of Brazil at the White House on Thursday at a moment of a fragile truce after a tense year of U.S. tariffs and public insults between the leaders of the Western Hemisphere's largest nations. Mr. Trump said on social media that he and Mr. Lula had discussed many topics, including trade, but the two leaders did not make the joint appearance before reporters that had been on their schedule. Mr. Trump wrote that the meeting went very well, and he called Mr. Lula very dynamic, but he offered very few details about what the two had discussed. The president made the post, which did not specify a reason the joint appearance hadn't been held, after Mr. Lula spent roughly 3 hours at the White House. Mr. Lula later offered a generally positive review of the meeting. "I leave the U.S. with an important step forward in consolidating the democratic and historical relations with the U.S., he told reporters at a Brazilian embassy in Washington. He added that the two largest democracies in the Western Hemisphere, the United States and Brazil, can serve as an example to the world. Mr. Lula said he and Mr. Trump had spoken about trade, crime, and critical minerals. Mr. Trump has subjected Brazil to a whiplash of measures, only to abruptly walk back several of the harshest penalties. Mr. Lula, a leftist, has condemned Mr. Trump's policies toward Iran and Cuba, along with his recent critical comments about Pope Leo XIV. The relationship between their countries has been marked by significant moments of acrimony. Mr. Trump used tariffs to try to force Brazil to drop its prosecution of his political ally, Jair Bolsonaro, the former right-wing Brazilian president who was ultimately convicted of plotting a coup to retain power after losing the previous election to Mr. Lula. Mr. Trump also imposed sanctions on the Brazilian Supreme Court justice overseeing Mr. Bolsonaro's case. Mr. Lula rejected Mr. Trump's moves as violations of Brazil's sovereignty. The United States eventually rolled back the tariffs on many key Brazilian exports, and Mr. Trump and Mr. Lula, who met late last year on the sidelines of a summit in Asia, have achieved a diplomatic détente of sorts in recent months. At the UN General Assembly last year, the two men embraced and had a brief exchange. "He seemed like a very nice man," Mr. Trump said. Bruno Santos, the director of the Brazil program at Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, described the relationship as controlled turbulence. She added, "We all know they aren't always seeing eye to eye, but they need each other." Analysts expected one topic at the meeting Thursday to be the Trump administration's potential designation of Brazil's two biggest drug gangs as terrorist groups, after lobbying by two of Mr. Bolsonaro's sons, including Flavio Bolsonaro, who's running for president. Security is the cornerstone issue for voters in Brazil's pivotal election in October, with polls showing Mr. Lula and Mr. Bolsonaro deadlocked. A terrorist designation could put a bigger spotlight on the issue and, analysts say, potentially help Mr. Bolsonaro, who has criticized Mr. Lula over his handling of crime. The Brazilian government has proposed a security agreement with the United States to take on criminal groups, but, Ms. Santos said, there are fears that a U.S. designation could open the door for military intervention. Mr. Lula told reporters that in raising the issue of organized crime, he told Mr. Trump that Brazil was willing to organize a working group of South American nations. "We can solve in a few years what we didn't solve in 100 years, he said. The two leaders had also been expected to discuss U.S. investigations against Brazil over its trade practices, which could potentially lead to more tariffs. On critical minerals, the United States has been pressing Brazil to enter an agreement to produce millions of tons of the elements needed to help power the economies and battlefields of the future, according to U.S. and Brazilian officials. Mr. Lula has been resistant to a deal, according to officials, because Brazil wants to control its resources and be able to sell them to countries beyond the United States. Brazil possesses one of the largest reserves of critical minerals, which include elements highly sought after by the United States. China, which has the largest reserve of critical minerals, has threatened to halt exports during trade battles, which has led the United States to seek minerals elsewhere, including in Brazil. The U.S. sees it as the one place where China can basically shut down parts of our economy, and Brazil is one of the few options for breaking the Chinese monopoly, said Ricardo Zuniga, a former top official for Latin American affairs in the Obama administration. Mr. Trump is scheduled to meet with President Xi Jinping of China next week in Beijing. The meeting on Thursday had originally been scheduled for March, but it was postponed because of the conflict with Iran. Mr. Trump, in trying to punish Brazil last year for pursuing the elder Mr. Bolsonaro, called the prosecution political persecution and a serious human rights abuse. Mr. Trump also posted a letter he had written to Mr. Lula on Truth Social, his social media platform, saying, "It is a witch hunt that should end immediately." Mr. Lula responded by unveiling a video featuring a new government theme. Brazil belongs to Brazilians, and it's spelled with an S for sovereignty. The tariffs triggered a defiant sense of national pride and a mix of economic anxiety among the business community. They also improved Mr. Lula's standing in the polls, though his popularity has since waned. In October, rollbacks and exemptions by the Trump administration eventually weakened the tariffs, which were invalidated by the U.S. Supreme Court in February. Mr. Bolsonaro was sentenced to 27 years in prison, though he is serving his punishment at a residence for health reasons. Mr. Lula told reporters on Thursday that all issues were open to negotiation, but that Brazil would not allow any interference in its internal affairs or threats to its democracy. He said he had also joked with Mr. Trump about how he hoped the U.S. president wouldn't cancel the visas of Brazilian soccer players coming to the U.S. to compete in next month's World Cup. Mr. Trump, Mr. Lula said, simply laughed. Also in international news, for Canada's ceremonial head of state, a symbol of rights and the rule of law, by Ian Austin. The Governor-General of Canada, Canada's head of state on behalf of King Charles III, is a post largely about symbolism. That significance was conveyed Tuesday when Prime Minister Mark Carney said that the next holder of the position will be Louise Arbour, a former Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, war crimes prosecutor, and United Nations Human Rights High Commissioner. At a time when most of the world is buffeted by crises and the worst are full of passionate intensity, Canada's history, our institutions, and our enduring traditions matter more than ever, Mr. Carney said, as he announced the appointment in the spacious atrium of the National Gallery of Canada. We retain our convictions. We reinforce our institutions. Ms. Arbour, he said, will represent the best of Canada to Canadians and to the world, a country that's a bastion of security, prosperity, and justice, a beacon to a world lost at sea. A Canada that is clear-eyed about the challenges we face and steadfast in the values we uphold. A Canada not just strong, but good. A Canada that's not just prosperous, but fair. A Canada that is not just for some, most of the time, but for all of the times. Ms. Arbour, 79, who's from Montreal, has a resume that distinguishes her from many of the previous governors-general since 1952, when the Canadian government began selecting them rather than having them sent from Britain. A disproportionately large number of those appointees had backgrounds in politics or journalism. After working as a civil liberties advocate and law professor, Ms. Arbour was a judge on 2 high courts in Ontario before being appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada in 1999. During her time there, Ms. Arbour was associated with several cases upholding human rights, including a decision lifting a ban on books featuring families with same-sex parents, introduced by a school board in British Columbia on religious grounds. She was also the chief prosecutor for the UN International Criminal Tribunals, where she investigated war crimes in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Her work helped lead to the indictment the former president of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, and successfully established that sexual violence is a weapon of genocide and a crime against humanity. Ms. Arbour also conducted inquiries into abuses at Canada's then principal prison for women and into widespread sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces, both of which brought about significant reforms. In her new role, Ms. Arbour will be the Commander-in-Chief of Canada's military. When asked how President Trump might view the appointment, Mr. Carney said, "As His Majesty King Charles observed just last week when he spoke before Congress to great applause, that the United States is a country founded on the rule of law, the right of individuals. And this is what we're enforcing, celebrating today, an institution at the core of our constitutional system with someone whose entire career has been dedicated to these principles." Like King Charles, Ms. Arbour must now avoid offering overt political opinions or views that could be interpreted as controversial. She did not directly respond when asked in French if she was a monarchist. Most polls suggest that since the death of Queen Elizabeth II, most Canadians, particularly in Quebec, no longer wish to have a monarch, but there's little clear agreement on what to do about it. "This term is unfortunately very often used in a pejorative way," she said. "What I can say is that I will accede to a function in which I will be the representative of the Crown in a constitutional arrangement that I think has served Canada extremely well." Similarly, she would not revisit her characterization of the American and Israeli attack on Iran as pure folly, as she put it in a recent television interview. "I was a private citizen who had freedom of expression," she said. "I am very, very aware of all the privileges and powers that come with certain functions and the constraints." Ms. Arbour's duties will include signing legislation and cabinet orders into law, swearing in prime ministers and their cabinet members, and the awarding of civil and military honors. Prime ministers must have her permission to call elections, form governments, or restart parliament, although precedent will likely preclude her from defying them. Ms. Arbour will host state visits by other leaders and will likely be sent by Mr. Carney on quasi-diplomatic foreign trips. During an interview with the Law Review in 2015, Ms. Arbour reflected on why she's taken on a wide variety of roles. She chalked it up to enjoying a challenge. "It's very clear," she said. "I really like that phase where I don't really get it. I've never walked away from anything I've done, from teaching, trial work, appellate work, international work, because I didn't like it, and even less so because I was bored. There's nothing boring about it. It's just that I seem to have this irresistible attraction to taking on something for which I'm entirely unqualified." Marco Rubio meets the Pope amid U.S. tensions with the Vatican. The meeting at the Vatican followed President Trump's condemnation of Pope Leo XIV for opposing the war in Iran by Motoko Rich. Amid growing tensions between President Trump and Pope Leo XIV, the pontiff met privately with Secretary of State Marco Rubio at the Vatican on Thursday morning. They discussed the situation in the Middle East and topics of a mutual interest in the Western Hemisphere, according to a statement from Tommy Pickett, the spokesman for the State Department. The meeting in the Pope's private library at a palace that overlooks St. Peter's Basilica took place days after President Trump escalated his attacks on Leo, who has consistently criticized the U.S. Israeli-led war on Iran. The Pope, the first from the United States, has emerged as a spiritual counterweight to Mr. Trump's leadership, encouraging American bishops to support immigrants amid a Trump administration crackdown and condemning the administration's military ambitions in the Middle East. President Trump told a conservative talk show host on Tuesday that Pope Leo was, quote, endangering a lot of Catholics, and that, quote, the Pope would rather talk about the fact that it's okay for Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and I don't think that's very good. Pope Leo, speaking later to reporters who asked about the president's latest remarks, said that if someone wants to criticize me for proclaiming the gospel, let him do so truthfully. The Church for years has spoken against all nuclear weapons, so there's no doubt there. And so I hope simply to be listened to for the value of the words of God. Mr. Rubio, speaking at the White House at a press briefing also on Tuesday, said that the president doesn't understand why anybody, leave aside the Pope, would think it's a good idea for Iran to ever have a nuclear weapon. The Pope has never said that it would be a good idea for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. On Thursday, Mr. Rubio was accompanied to the Vatican by his wife, Jeanette Dudeb-Rubio. The secretary then met one-on-one with the Pope. A photo released by L'Osservatore Romano, a Vatican-owned newspaper, showed the secretary sitting to the side of the Pope's desk, apparently listening in concentration while the Pope spoke. In the State Department statement, Mr. Pickett said that the meeting underscored the strong relationship between the United States and the Holy See and their shared commitment to promoting peace and human dignity. Mr. Rubio will stay in Rome through Friday, when he's scheduled to meet Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani of Italy. You were listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. New York bars ICE agents from wearing masks in broad immigration deal. State and local officials will also be prohibited from formally cooperating with Immigration and Customs Enforcement under the agreement, by Grace Ashford. 4 months after masked federal agents shot and killed Renee Good and Alex Pretty on the streets of Minneapolis, New York leaders announced a plan to implement some of the strictest rules for immigration officials of any state in the country. The package, which was included in the state budget deal announced on Thursday, prohibits state and local officials from entering into formal or informal cooperation agreements with the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and bars law enforcement agents from wearing masks. The rules also prohibit ICE from using local jails to house detainees and from searching New Yorkers' homes, hospitals, churches, and schools without a warrant signed by a judge. Kathy Hochul said on Thursday that the changes were necessary given the extent of the Trump administration's immigration crackdown. They didn't just target hardened criminals and gang members, which I would have supported. We did support, Ms. Hochul said. They also targeted mothers still nursing their infants, separating them, an 85-year-old widow in her nightgown. She said that ICE had used intimidation tactics to evade responsibility, adding, New York will no longer stand for it. Still, the new rules place no restrictions on unofficial communications between law enforcement and ICE, after Ms. Hochul fought hard to ensure that was the case. There is a great deal more to this article, and we will be happy to read it to you if you would like to hear more. So if you want to hear more of this article, you can call 716-821-5555, and staff will be happy to read it to you. Another article in national news is that soil at a D.C. golf course where east wing debris was dumped contains toxic metals. The National Park Service said the dump of debris between the 4th and 9th holes does not exceed environmental limits, but opponents disagree. This is by Maxine Joselau. Soil at a public golf course in Washington, where Trump administration dumped debris from the demolition of the White House East Wing, has tested positive for lead, chromium, and other toxic metals, according to data released by the National Park Service. The data, which the Park Service published on its website last week, showed relatively low levels of these contaminants in the soil at East Potomac Golf Links. Yet the dump raised questions about the decision by the Trump administration to bypass environmental laws when it dropped truckloads of mud, rebar, plaster, and other debris in the middle of the popular public course near the Jefferson Memorial. The president is planning a sweeping overhaul of the 105-year-old golf course, where generations have played in view of monuments and memorials at bargain rates that currently run $42 for 18 holes on weekdays. Mr. Trump wants to transform it into a championship course, which would likely spell the end to an existing mini golf course, as well as a surrounding roadway that's popular with cyclists and runners. Again, this is a longer article, which we will be happy to read to you if you would like to hear more, and you can call 716-821-5555. Another long article, which I will not read in its entirety, is Employees with Medical Conditions Challenge the CDC in-office requirement. The health agency has been particularly strict in abolishing at-home work, overriding accommodations that were granted years before the pandemic by Apurva Mandavili. One employee is a survivor of a gastrointestinal cancer who sometimes loses control of her bowels. Another is undergoing breast cancer treatment that leaves her vulnerable to infections. A third has severely limited mobility and excruciating pain. They all work for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which has told them they must commute to the office every day regardless of their medical conditions. Before President Trump returned to the White House, many disabled CDC employees, including veterans and uniformed members of the Public Health Service, had permission to work from home, an accommodation granted long before the COVID pandemic made remote work routine. But in response to a January 2025 executive order, the Department of Health and Human Services, which includes the CDC, canceled all existing accommodations for disabilities and required employees to report to physical offices. The executive order explicitly allowed for exemptions as needed, but the HHS and CDC have interpreted it more strictly than many other federal agencies have. Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. aggressively carried out other executive personnel orders, too, overseeing widespread layoffs last year that reduced the CDC workforce by about 2,400 employees, more than at many other agencies. Among the cuts were officials with the expertise to vet requests for accommodations. Most of the agency's leaders were also placed on administrative leave or fired. Hundreds of CDC employees with medical conditions have filed complaints about an in-office requirement with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which their union estimates will cost the agency about $200 million to address. There is a great deal more to this article, and as I said, if you want to hear more, call 716-821-5555, and we'll be happy to read it to you. As the U.S. debt hits a worrying milestone, Washington barely notices. The debt is outgrowing the size of America's economy. The president's policies could accelerate the country's fiscal headaches, experts say, unless policymakers intervene. By Tony Rahm. The U.S. government learned last week that it may have reached an unfortunate milestone. The size of its debt surpassed the nation's total economic output. It was a striking imbalance, according to early estimates, one that the country has experienced only in rare circumstances, briefly during the pandemic and in the aftermath of World War II. But the development barely seemed to register in the nation's capital, where few policymakers bothered to acknowledge the latest warning sign about the government's poor fiscal health. The root of the problem is well documented and widely known. U.S. debt has soared in recent years because of a mismatch between federal spending and tax revenue, one complicated by a rapidly aging population, which has driven up costs across government. For economists, the fear is that these conditions are inching the United States toward a fiscal crisis, one in which its debt is so great that the country can't easily afford to pay the rising interest on it. But their warnings have long gone unheeded in Washington, calcifying the strains on the government's balancing sheet in ways that President Trump's agenda is expected to exacerbate. Despite winning a congressional majority, Republicans have cut little in spending over the past year. With the few savings they did achieve, they put that money toward offsetting a fraction of the cost of Mr. Trump's tax cuts, which are still expected to add more than $4 trillion to the debt in the coming years. Those fiscal risks aren't yet fully realized in the total federal debt held by the public, which topped about $31.26 trillion in March, federal records show. By comparison, the nation's nominal gross domestic product, a measure of its output using current dollars, reached $31.21 trillion in the 12-month period ending in March, according to data released last Thursday and analyzed by the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which supports deficit reduction. As a result, the ratio of debt to GDP, a widely regarded metric for assessing the government's fiscal health, slightly exceeded 100% in the committee's calculations. That last occurred for a short period in 2020 as the pandemic clobbered the economy and government shelled out trillions in emergency relief, the group found. Mark Goldwein, its senior vice president, said the symbolic milestone helped to illustrate the fiscal risk facing the United States. If its debt continues to grow faster than the economy, he said, it will only become more expensive for the government to borrow money as investors demand higher yields on bonds to finance that debt. When that happens, at some point, you're in this debt spiral, Mr. Goldwein said. The only way to stop it is through some kind of big shock to the system. Yet the reaction on Capitol Hill appeared muted, despite years of hand-wringing among Republicans in particular about the need for fiscal restraint. Representative Jody Arrington, Republican of Texas and chairman of the House Budget Committee, described the new level of the nation's debt as a flashing red light for the economy, but he acknowledged that both parties were responsible for sleepwalking off of a cliff. I think, unfortunately, too many people are used to these flashing red indicators that we have significant structural problems with America's balance sheet, he said. Nor did the Trump administration have anything to say directly about the level of debt surpassing economic growth. Kush Desai, a White House spokesman, claimed instead that the government's fiscal standing had actually improved under Mr. Trump, as he pointed to work to slash the pervasive waste, fraud, and abuse in federal spending. To be sure, economists and policymakers do not believe the U.S. government is staring down an imminent calamity. For one thing, it's possible that the nation's fiscal crunch eases some, at least on paper, if economic growth picks up and spending slows, as the Trump administration anticipates. In the first 3 months of the year, the U.S. economy grew at an annual rate of about 2%, according to federal data released last week. Mr. Trump's advisors have long proclaimed that growth would accelerate, citing the president's agenda and other trends, including the rise of artificial intelligence, though the war with Iran has dampened some experts' outlook. The federal budget deficit, the annual gap between what the government spends and what it takes in through taxes and other revenue, fell in the first 6 months of the current fiscal year, according to congressional figures. But the Trump administration itself has recently estimated that the annual imbalance will still reach around $2 trillion by the end of fiscal 2026, which could mark an increase from a year earlier. Adding to the challenges, the U.S. government is just beginning to refund billions of dollars collected from Mr. Trump's once vaunted and now illegal global tariffs, with the first checks expected to reach businesses next week. That could further rattle the nation's finances, just as the Trump administration simultaneously confronts the potentially towering cost of the Iran war. All of the data could still be revised in the coming months, but budget experts nonetheless say it raises concern about the rate of growth in U.S. debt and the signals that it sends to the global economy. Well before last week, the 3 major credit ratings agencies had each downgraded the United States, pointing to the country's mounting and long unresolved fiscal constraints as reason to doubt its financial outlook. The poor marks in recent years have also spurred concerns that unchecked debt could lead investors to demand higher payments on government bonds, making borrowing more expensive for Washington. Yields on those bonds have jumped repeatedly under Mr. Trump, most recently because of the war with Iran, sending the 30-year bond to about 5% at one point this week, before later settling. Such costs tend to ripple through the economy, so high yields on government bonds can also make it more expensive for consumers and businesses to borrow money, said Joe Seidel, a senior markets economist for J.P. Morgan Private Bank. We're already in territory where this is putting upward pressure on interest rates, and it's having an economic effect, he said, of the current debt, although he cautioned that it certainly hadn't precipitated any sort of fiscal crisis. In its annual report, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office projected in February that the government's debt would outpace the economic growth this year and worsen in the years to follow. Pointing to a changing, aging workforce, the scorekeeper estimated that U.S. debt held by the public would soar to 120% of gross domestic product by the end of 2036. If that occurred, the Budget Office warned, the risk of fiscal crisis would increase, eroding trust in the dollar and constraining the ability of lawmakers to respond to the unforeseen events or for other purposes, such as to promote economic activity or strengthen national defense. Once again, there are a few more paragraphs to this article, And so, if you want to hear the rest of it, please call 716-821-5555, and staff will be very happy to read it to you. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The guest editorial today is by Jason Bordoff, the founding director of the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, and a professor of professional practice in international and public affairs. He served in President Obama's administration from 2009 to 2013 as a senior director of the U.S. National Security Council and as a special assistant to the president. It's entitled, "If OPEC Falls Apart, It'll Cost Us All." The White House declared last week that President Trump finally broke OPEC after the United Arab Emirates withdrew from the cartel. That must have been satisfying. Mr. Trump has criticized OPEC for decades. But Mr. Trump did not cause the breakup, and the White House's celebrations may prove premature. For the moment, the UAE's exit changes little. Over time, a weaker OPEC may mean not lower prices, but greater volatility, more violent swings that households and businesses will struggle to absorb. Oil prices are poised to surge in the coming weeks as global inventories run dry. Washington should seize this moment to reduce America's exposure to boom and bust oil price cycles that are primed to worsen. Over the past decade, OPEC and a Russian-led bloc of other producers have restrained their oil output to prop up Brent crude prices, which, save for a crash during the COVID-19 pandemic, have hovered between $65 and $80 per barrel, occasionally spiking. Helped by that price floor, U.S. oil output has surged by around 5 million barrels per day, a more than 50% increase. By contrast, when OPEC chose not to cut production in 2014, oil prices collapsed, and so did U.S. investment in extracting its own petroleum. U.S. producers know that if OPEC didn't exist to stabilize prices, someone would have to invent it. Indeed, the United States did. After oil was discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859, prospectors swarmed to the region. Production soared, and from 1860 to 1862, oil prices crashed from $20 to as low as 10 cents per barrel. The first of many epic price busts in oil's history, as Robert McNally writes in the book Crude Volatility. The boom-bust cycles became so destabilizing that Texas, not known for favoring government regulation, imposed production limits enforced by armed troops on horseback. As U.S. oil demand exceeded supply and imports rose, Texas was eventually forced to scrap its quotas in 1972. A damn historic occasion, as the chairman of the Texas Railroad Commission proclaimed at the time, and OPEC took up the mantle of the world's oil market manager. The UAE's break with OPEC after nearly 60 years in the bloc has been years in the making. More than most OPEC producers, the UAE invested heavily to expand its production capacity, only to find itself constrained by quotas that limited the payoff. But the timing and manner of its exit, without first aligning with Saudi Arabia, OPEC's de facto leader, cannot be understood through oil markets alone. It also reflects politics. Senior Emiratis have voiced their anger that regional partners such as Saudi Arabia did not stand more firmly with the UAE as it absorbed a disproportionate share of Iranian attacks over the past 2 months. The UAE also probably chose to move now because its exit will have little impact under current circumstances. At any other moment, the break would have sent oil prices sharply lower on the assumption that the UAE would boost output and Saudi Arabia might follow. But with the Strait of Hormuz closed, neither can increase production even if it wanted to. Once the strait reopens, OPEC members will need to produce at high levels to offset the months in which they could sell little of their oil. Over time, the UAE's exit could make OPEC less effective at managing the oil market, adding barrels to the global supply when prices soar and removing them when prices crash. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been the only OPEC producers with the spare capacity to substantially cushion price spikes. If the UAE produced full-on outside the cartel, that buffer would shrink. The Saudis have always played the largest role in this market, steadying, but their willingness to cut their production may also fade if a major neighbor benefits from Saudi restraint without contributing cuts of its own. More countries may exit OPEC following the UAE, Angola, Ecuador, and Qatar, all of whom have left since 2019. A less effective OPEC might seem a blessing when prices fall, but it would force the world to endure more frequent booms and busts. The greater oil price volatility that might be in store would be costly. When oil prices swing sharply, consumers become less confident about what they'll spend on gasoline, heating oil, or air travel. Businesses shorten planning horizons and postpone investments. Energy producers may delay drilling, while companies that use a lot of energy hesitate to expand when future fuel costs are more uncertain. The best response is to make the U.S. economy less vulnerable to oil price shocks. That starts with refilling the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which has been drawn down by both political parties, yet remains an important source of crude in times of need. America's leaders should also think more creatively about how the government could help smooth the effects of boom and bust oil price cycles. For example, fuel taxes could rise when oil prices fall and decline when prices spike. Or oil company taxes might increase when prices soar and ease when they slump. Even more effective would be reducing the economy's exposure to oil. America's high levels of oil production help the country better withstand price shocks, but even more important have been moves to cut its dependence on oil. Imposing stronger fuel economy standards on cars and trucks, offering more incentives for buying electric vehicles, and building transportation alternatives like high-speed rail and public transit are economic security necessities, not just climate ones. When oil shocks hit, Washington inevitably scrambles to ease the pain, but the most effective defenses take time to build. Energy security shouldn't be measured by whether OPEC is weaker or whether politicians have someone to blame when prices spike, but by whether the next inevitable swing in oil prices hurts less than the last one. Turning to some business news, Anthropic's CEO says it could grow by 80 times this year. This is by Natalie Rocha. Dario Amodei, the chief executive of Anthropic, said on Wednesday that his artificial intelligence company had planned for growing about 10 times as big this year, only to reach a growth rate that could make it 80 times as big this year instead. Mr. Amodei, 43, made his remarks at Anthropic's annual developer conference in San Francisco, where he and other executives gave a glimpse into the company's plans. Anthropic is one of the world's leading AI startups with its Claude chatbot and its popular AI coding tool, Claude Code, which people can pay to subscribe to. Last month, Anthropic said its annual revenue run rate had surpassed $30 billion, up from $9 billion at the end of 2025. At the conference, Mr. Amodei said Anthropic had been overwhelmed by the rate of growth, which has increased the company's need for computing power to deliver its AI products to customers. I hope that 80 times growth doesn't continue because that's just crazy and it's too hard to handle, Mr. Amodei said. I am hoping for some more normal numbers. To obtain more computing power, Anthropic has signed a series of deals with industry giants. At the conference, Anthropic said it had sealed an agreement with Elon Musk's SpaceX to use all of the computing capacity from the rocket company's Colossus One data center in Memphis. The move gives Anthropic access to the computing power of more than 220,000 NVIDIA AI chips, the company said, and opens the door to working with SpaceX to create AI data centers in space. Anthropic declined to disclose the terms of the deal. SpaceX did not respond to a request for comment. As you saw today with the SpaceX compute deal, we're working as quickly as possible to provide more compute than we have in the past, Mr. Amodei said, using an industry term for computing power. He added that his company was working every day to obtain even more compute for users. With the SpaceX deal, Anthropic said it can expand the amount of coding that some Claude Code subscribers can do before they hit a usage limit with the tool. Anthropic offers people different pricing depending on the amount of coding they want to do. Last month, Google, which has been a longtime investor in the startup, committed to invest as much as another $40 billion in Anthropic. Amazon, another investor in Anthropic, agreed to invest as much as $25 billion. Looking at the deal book section, Kalshi, the prediction market, is now valued at $22 billion. The platform for betting on sports, politics, the weather, and more has raised $1 billion and sees big financial firms as a key source of growth. By Michael J. de la Merced. Since the 2024 presidential election, Kalshi has helped take prediction markets mainstream, as individual users have flocked to its platform to bet on sports, politics, and more. Now the company has raised more money as it seeks to make inroads with major financial institutions. Kalshi plans to announce on Thursday that it has raised $1 billion in a new round of funding, led by the investment firm Coatue Management, that values the startup at $22 billion. The round is the company's third in 7 months, each of which roughly doubled the company's valuation. The December round made Kalshi's founder, Tariq Mansour, and Luana Lopez Lara billionaires on paper. The new fundraising round is the latest sign of fervid investor interest in prediction markets, despite a fusillade of lawsuits from state regulators over their sports bidding on the platforms and concern about insider trading. Prediction markets like Kalshi and Polymarket have become big business as users have flocked to bet on sports, the winner of the latest season of Survivor, the high temperature in New York City, and more. Kalshi claims about 2 million users monthly. That's reflected in vertiginous growth for Kalshi's business. The company said its annualized trading volume had hit $178 billion, more than tripling over the past 6 months. And the company's annualized revenue, an extrapolation of its current top-line numbers, is more than $1.5 billion. Literally, outside of AI, you don't see anything growing like that, Lucas Swisher, Coatue's co-lead of growth investing, said in an interview. Yet, while Kalshi's supercharged growth has come primarily from individual users, the company is betting that use by institutional investors, including financial firms like hedge funds and brokerages, will be another avenue of growth. Last week, Kalshi executed its first custom block trade, a large transaction negotiated off a public market between institutions. And the company said trading volume on its platform from institutional investors had grown 800% over the last 6 months. Not only would getting those bigger users bring in another potentially significant source of revenue, but also that added volume could help make the prices of contracts on its platform more accurate, Mr. Mansour, who is also Kalshi's chief executive, said in an interview. From a business perspective, the current business is working great, he said, adding, as we think about the vision of what we've always wanted to build, the next step is going to do institutionals, because that's how you get a deeper layer of liquidity. Kalshi's chief rival, Polymarket, has also had its eyes on big financial firms. It raised a round of capital from the Intercontinental Exchange, the parent of the New York Stock Exchange, in October. That growing focus on institutional users helped drive the latest fundraising round. Coatue approached Kalshi about an investment in late February, and the firm's origin as a hedge fund and familiarity with trading markets made it a compelling new partner, according to Mr. Mansour. Institutions want to work with a regulated entity that follows the rules and cares about insider trading, Mr. Swisher said. He added that institutional trading has the chance to be the vast majority of the businesses in several years. Other investors include Sequoia Capital, Andreessen Horowitz, IVP, Paradigm, Morgan Stanley, and ARK Invest. Kalshi plans to use the funds to further expand its services for corporate users, including more data integrations for trading firms and more block trading. But the company still faces challenges on several fronts. State regulators have sued the company over the legality of its sports betting. Skeptics of the lawsuit say such moves are driven partly by the potential loss of gaming-related tax revenue as gamblers move away from casinos and online sportsbooks. Kalshi has scored some victories on that front, including on Tuesday when a federal judge permanently blocked Arizona from prosecuting the company for what state officials said were violations of state gaming laws. There's also the negative publicity that prediction markets have faced in recent months. The platforms have faced outrage over instances where bettors appeared to profit by wagering on events in which they had prior knowledge, particularly those involving military operations. In one high-profile case involving Polymarket, federal prosecutors charged an Army Special Forces soldier with using classified information to make money on the American operation to oust Nicolas Maduro, the former Venezuelan president. He has pleaded not guilty. Then there's the prospect of deepening competition beyond Polymarket, which is opening access to a new U.S. regulated platform. Its core market is restricted to overseas bettors. Firms that have moved into the business include interactive brokers and even online sportsbooks like DraftKings. Mr. Mansour said he wasn't worried. Competition is a very, very, very good thing, he said. It enables growth for everybody. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Congress is doing little to prepare for potential AI job losses. As fears of AI-driven job losses mount, economists warn that unemployment benefits and other programs to help displaced workers aren't sufficient. By Ben Castleman and Tony Rum. Economists aren't sure if or when artificial intelligence will cause widespread job losses, but they do agree on one thing. The federal safety net isn't ready for such a shock. The nearly century-old unemployment system, which provides out-of-work Americans with up to 26 weeks of benefits in most states, is unlikely to cover many of the workers who are most at risk of being displaced by AI, labor experts warn. Job training programs and other forms of aid designed for an earlier era of displaced workers haven't been updated for the current threat or, in some cases, have lapsed altogether. And Republicans in Congress last year made it more difficult for people without jobs to receive food assistance and health care benefits that are meant to be the last line of defense for struggling families. The bottom line, if droves of Americans are disrupted by technology, and turn to the government for help, they may find the aid insufficient, or worse yet, be ineligible to receive it. Economists disagree about whether such a wave of job losses is likely. Despite recent layoff announcements at tech companies, banks, and other corporations, unemployment remains low by historical standards, but surveys show that workers are worried about their job security. Economists have become more convinced that AI will displace workers in specific fields, even if it doesn't lead to the broader increase in unemployment that some in Silicon Valley predict. Overall, layoffs ticked up in March but rose more significantly in the information sector, data released on Tuesday showed, which has been among the fastest to adopt AI tools. Still, there's been little preparation in Washington for a severe labor crunch. Nascent efforts to upgrade unemployment insurance have gained little momentum on Capitol Hill. And the Trump administration, which has embraced AI and opposed efforts to slow its progress, has dismissed suggestions that the technology is a threat to jobs at all. Labor experts say that the government should begin preparing for AI job losses now, rather than waiting until the crisis has begun. After years of atrophy and neglect, they say, unemployment insurance and other safety net programs are long overdue for an overhaul. Our systems are really built for a very different time, said Maria Flynn, president of Jobs for the Future, a nonprofit focused on labor force issues. Policymakers, she said, need to focus on ways to push our systems to be more agile and more future-looking at this moment where I think it's very likely that some more workers and different types of workers are going to be relying on them. The COVID-19 pandemic showed how critical government aid can be during economic upheaval. Over just a few weeks in the spring of 2020, more than 20 million Americans lost their jobs. Unemployment benefits, along with programs like food stamps and Medicaid, provided a vital lifeline. But the pandemic also showed how frayed the safety net has become. Archaic computer systems delayed payouts and limited the options available to lawmakers. Entire categories of workers, including contractors, gig workers, and many part-time employees, weren't eligible for unemployment benefits at all. Congress passed a patchwork of temporary programs to fill the gaps, including pandemic unemployment assistance. But The programs, effective at helping many workers weather the pandemic, proved vulnerable to fraud and abuse. Many experts on unemployment insurance hoped that Congress, along with state agencies that administer the benefits, would apply the lessons of the pandemic and enact reforms to modernize the program and expand its reach. Had we just solidified that and fixed some of the issues, we would be better prepared for this AI apocalypse or whatever happens, said Gbenga Aijilore, chief economist at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, a left-leaning think tank. Some states did take steps to upgrade their computer systems or adopt other reforms, but efforts by some Democrats in Congress to make gig workers permanently eligible for benefits never gained traction, and several states, including Kentucky and Iowa, passed laws reducing the number of weeks for which laid-off employees can receive benefits. Partly as a result, the share of jobless workers who are receiving unemployment benefits has fallen, close to a record low. The holes in the unemployment system could leave it particularly ill-prepared for AI-driven job losses. Benefits amounts are too small and durations too short to support displaced workers while they retrain for other careers. In Florida, where benefits are particularly limited, workers qualify for a maximum of $275 per week for a maximum of 12 weeks. And that is if unemployed workers qualify for benefits at all. Recent graduates, for example, appear likely to be at the front lines of AI job disruptions, but most can't receive unemployment insurance because they haven't worked long enough to pay into the system. Many economists also think AI is likely to push more people into gig and contract work, which the existing system doesn't cover. Our benefit system was built around a single employer relationship that more workers may not have, said Leah Palagashvili, an economist at Mercatus Center, a libertarian-leaning think tank at George Mason University. Ms. Palagashvili has argued that states should adopt portable benefits that allows workers to take health insurance, retirement plans, and other benefits with them when they change employers or strike out on their own. That would make it easier for AI-displaced workers to become freelancers or to start businesses. States should also develop ways to provide unemployment-style benefits to contractors when they can't find work, she said. Senator Ron Wyden, an Oregon Democrat who helped lead the unsuccessful effort to expand the unemployment system after the pandemic, is working on a bill that would provide income support to workers who are displaced by AI and pursuing career retraining. The proposal is meant to augment benefits that out-of-work Americans receive once they lose their jobs, according to the senator's aides. The bottom line to the Congress is it's important to show workers and working families we're not going to sit back and let them have their livelihoods be run over roughshod, Mr. Wyden said in an interview. At the White House, aides to President Trump have dismissed the doomsday scenarios around AI. Kevin Hassett, the director of the White House National Economic Council, has insisted that the technology will make workers more productive rather than replace them. The Trump administration has focused on boosting AI, particularly by encouraging investment. Last month, the president also asked the Labor Department to review federal work training retraining programs so that they are calibrated to serve emerging industries and companies. Asked about potential updates to the safety net, Pierre Yared, the acting director of the Council of Economic Advisors, said the government needed to be mindful of policy trade-offs. The last thing you'd want is to do something that could somehow hamper the amount of innovation that we can experience, Mr. Yared said, noting, we simultaneously want to focus on minimizing the temporary disruption while also ensuring success. Many in Silicon Valley are less sanguine about the impact that AI will have on workers. Tech executives have been urging politicians to begin planning for mass job losses. But they've focused less on reforms to existing programs and more on ambitious solutions, such as a universal basic income, which would provide cash directly to all families, regardless of whether they worked. The idea has high-profile adherents in the AI industry, including Sam Altman, the head of OpenAI, and Elon Musk, whose business empire includes an AI lab, XAI. Universal high income via checks issued by the federal government is the best way to deal with the unemployment caused by AI, Mr. Musk wrote in a post on X last month. Government policy, however, has been moving in the opposite direction. The tax bill passed by Congress last year included strict work requirements that make it harder for people without jobs to qualify for food assistance or Medicaid, the health insurance program for low-income Americans. It feels like there's one conversation happening in this very abstract way about if AI changes the world, then we want a basic income and we want a sovereign wealth fund. And then there's the real world conversation where we're making benefits more restrictive, said Aviva Arendine, director of the Hamilton Project, an economic policy arm of the Brookings Institute. This isn't the first time policymakers have confronted the possibility of job losses caused by shifts in the broader economy. In the early 1960s, Congress created Trade Adjustment Assistance, which is meant to help workers displaced by globalization. The program, which went through numerous changes over subsequent decades, succeeded in helping some workers transition to new careers, research suggests, but limited funding and restrictive eligibility requirements meant it never reached many of the workers it was meant to help. Congress allowed the program to expire in 2022. That failure had long-run consequences, not just for affected workers, but also for public support for free trade, said Jacob Leibenluft, a fellow at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, who recently published a paper on the lessons of the Trade Adjustment Program. I do hope, and this may be over-optimistic on my part, that policymakers will have learned some of the lessons of trade and what happens when you lose a degree of public buy-in to a system, Mr. Leibenluft said. A more expansive safety net, he said, could help ease public anxiety about the effects of AI. Ideally, he added, policymakers recognize that being proactive in addressing that is important if you want to maintain social cohesion in a moment of economic change. A list of a few other articles you might be interested in having read to you. She didn't want to live with advanced dementia, so why was she being kept alive? Justice Department sues Colorado over gun law. Federal and state officials discuss closing Florida's alligator Alcatraz. The appeals court looks unlikely to allow Hegseth to punish Senator for video. Jack Smith calls the Justice Department corrupted by Trump and his allies. Justice Department accuses UCLA Medical School of bias against white and Asian applicants. FBI raid of Democrats' office jolts Virginia politics. Mom Donnie wants free buses for all. The city council has different ideas. And a few in business. CEOs lean in on resilience to manage global turmoil. Oil prices waver amid mixed signals on renewed U.S. peace talks. J.P. Morgan tried to settle harassment accusations against an executive. And Shell reports nearly $7 billion profit amid unprecedented disruption. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from the May 8th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Dasha. Thank you for listening.